Academy.
To the bemusement of critics and many within the industry, in the spring of 1984, Police Academy became one of the surprise hits of the decade and the 6th highest grossing film of the year. On a budget of just $4.5 million, the film made $150 million at the worldwide box office. From there, production team and studio took the concept of the sequel to a whole new level. A new Police Academy film came off the production line and hit cinemas every year for the rest of the decade. So even if many now know Police Academy from Saturday afternoon TV reruns and The Simpsons...
Why do you think I took in all those Police Academy movies? For fun? Well, I didn't hear anybody laughing, did you?
This cinematic universe was, at least for a few years, no joke from a business perspective, with the potential of Police Academy becoming its own billion-dollar industry. So how did this surprise success story happen? Were the Police Academy films really as bad as Rotten Tomatoes would have you believe? Does Steve Guttenberg have the coolest resume of any 80s film star? Could modern-day Hollywood take any lessons from the unexpected success of Police Academy? And how many Police Academy films even are there? 7. The answer is 7 films. As we career towards the 40th anniversary of the release of the first Police Academy movie, ride shotgun as we take a journey to discover the answer to these and other questions. But first, let's set the scene of early 1984, as the video game industry crashes and the glory days of the arcade come to an abrupt halt. The first Apple Macintosh computer goes on sale to the public.
Introducing Macintosh.
Torval and Dean ice dance the bolero to a perfect score at the Winter Olympics. MTV is preparing for the first ever Video Music Awards, and Cabbage Patch Kid Mania is in full swing. Meanwhile, Owner of a Lonely Heart, Jump, and Karma Chameleon top the charts. In the movie business, the key Hollywood trends of the 1980s will become those that the industry would lean into for the coming decades. A growing interest in franchising IP and tentpole summer blockbusters, hit theme songs and soundtrack-driven concept films, and an ever-increasing reliance on sequels will become the norm. Police Academy would at least attempt to tap into most of these trends, especially the sequels part. Before all of that, however, came the first big breakout hit. As winter turns to spring, over in Burbank, California, Warner Brothers are preparing for the release of an ensemble comedy about a group of eccentric police cadets. Expectations for the picture at the studio are, sadly, not very high.
It does not look good.
Police Academy would never have existed without the quick thinking of one man. Film producer Paul Maslansky, undoubtedly the godfather and driving force behind the franchise. Whilst on location for the film The Right Stuff in 1982, he had been inspired by being a witness to a real-life policy of the San Francisco police force. They had adopted a fair employment hiring policy which saw them being required to accept cadets from any background, no matter their aptitude for the job. In San Francisco, they were able to flunk them out after 3 weeks. But Maslansky wondered what might happen if a ragtag bunch of unlikely cops actually graduated and became fully fledged police officers. That night, Maslansky wrote a 2-page treatment for what would become Police Academy, and this chance encounter created the premise for the film that would change his life. He pitched the concept to the Ladd Company, who agreed to finance the project if Maslansky could bring it in for under $5 million. Not a huge amount for a picture, even in the early 80s. Thanks to Ladd's distribution deal with Warner's, the film had a direct route to cinema screens as well. Police Academy followed another trend in the late 70s and early 80s of Hollywood, the wave of slobs versus snobs comedy which began and peaked with Animal House and extended onto the likes of Porky's and Caddyshack. Dirty of mind and dirt cheap to make, this became a genre unto itself, with Hollywood returning to the formula time and time again, delivering mixed results in the process. Once Maslansky had the funding guaranteed, what he needed was a script to shoot. The original version of Police Academy was written by Neil Israel, who directed Bachelor Party, also released in 1984, and Pat Proft, later to co-write both The Naked Gun and Hot Shots. Following the tone of the genre films which had come before it, the first draft was pretty filthy. Although some of that remained in the final film, along with the basic story, the script was then tweaked by Hugh Wilson, a TV sitcom director who had arrived to direct Police Academy. It soon found a middle ground between the less PC elements and a lighter, more slapstick sensibility. As Maslansky said to Wilson, "Let's keep some of the flatulence in." With flatulence intact, the film's production was greenlit. Police Academy is one of those films where the title is pretty much all you need to know about the plot. A diverse bunch of slackers, delinquents, underachievers, a socialite, and even a florist all decide to heed the call and attempt to join the force. Central character Kerry Mahoney is only there to avoid jail time, though he eventually changes his tune once he falls for rich girl Karen Thompson. The chief of police wants them out, so instructs Lieutenant Harris to make their lives hell. But Commandant Lassard and Sergeant Callahan are far less hostile to their new arrivals. From there, hijinks ensue. Can the cadets prove themselves enough to make it through and graduate? Or will they be chucked back to their old lives as the snobs intend to? And that's the plot, really. In the climax, the cadets have their first experience of dealing with real-world police work when a riot breaks out and they're dumped into the middle of it, but it's pretty basic stuff overall. Really though, it doesn't need to be anything more, and nobody is hoping for Oscar consideration. Police Academy was shot in Toronto in the summer of 1983 and was filmed in just 45 days, all part of the cost-cutting drive determined by Maslansky's agreed budget. The cast was filled out by a variety of comedians, jobbing actors, and former American footballers. Some had fairly sizable career resumes, while some were just starting out. Kim Cattrall had even been a prominent member of the cast of Porky's a couple of years earlier. The ensemble was headed up by the then little-known Steve Guttenberg, who beat out the likes of Bruce Willis for the part of Mahoney. As the final film was delivered and a release date approached, sentiment amongst studio execs was not positive. As one exec noted at the time, the film needed more flatulence, more slobbishness, more TNA. Another asked Paul Maslansky if he was trying to make another Tootsie, a film which is worth noting was the second highest grossing release of 1982. Steve Guttenberg's manager Sandy Gallin turned to him after one screening to tell him that it was the biggest piece of he'd ever seen. To add to the disdain from studio execs, critics absolutely savaged the film.
Police Academy is the latest dismal failure. This movie is bad.
As Michael Winslow recalls, optimism for success amongst key players could hardly be lower. There were no expectations. No one thought it would make it. Police Academy was released on March 23rd, 1984 in the United States. And the thing is, the audiences loved it. Test screening scores had been strong, and when the film landed in cinemas, it defied the critics and absolutely blew up. Police Academy rapidly started making serious money. Takings from its opening 3 weeks eclipsed those achieved by much more fancied recent releases Splash and Footloose. Not long after the film had opened, Paul Maslansky phoned Steve Guttenberg to give him some news. "Steve, I'm a millionaire." Word of mouth soon spread about this crazy little film that delivered exactly the kind of comedy audiences were craving. Ideal for a Friday night at the movies. After spending 3 weeks at the top of the US box office in March and April 1984, Police Academy dropped down to second place the following week, in the face of the release of the definitely not true to its title, Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. The next week, however, it was back at number 1, increasing its takings week on week in its 5th week on release. Police Academy was the people's choice. Take that, Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes.
I don't know what that is.
As Police Academy was released around the world across the coming months,
Police Academy.
it continued to find a willing audience, with the more slapstick moments being ideally suited to cross-language barriers. Adjusted for inflation, the near $150 million haul at the worldwide box office would be the equivalent of $440 million in today's money, and was more than 30 times its original production budget. This was bolstered by tens of millions more from home video, TV rights, and other takings over the coming months and years.
Well, comedy is certainly no crime, as we find out in the film Police Academy.
Not bad for a low-budget comedy that was dismissed by many and received a 0 score from critics.
I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
So, why did it happen? This was a simpler time, and people got their kicks any way they could. Video rental shops wouldn't fully explode in popularity for a year or so, and commercial internet was more than a decade off. Watching Mahoney and friends attempt to graduate from the Police Academy was high-impact content for younger audiences in 1984. Arriving as part of the traditionally quieter spring cinema slate, and in turn avoiding what by the mid-80s was already the annual busy summer release season. Police Academy was ideally placed to succeed, even if many of those in the know didn't see it coming. Honestly, I think a lot of the success is down to the casting being absolutely pinpoint perfect. The cast delivers the heart which every rowdy comedy needs at its core. They really do come across as legitimate friends. From reading and hearing interviews with cast members, they all seem to say it was the most fun set to be on, which might partly explain, apart from money, why so many kept on coming back so many times. I mean, Police Academy 5 was literally an excuse to hang out and party on Miami Beach. But watching the first film, you really believe they are a group of friends. In terms of performances, Michael Winslow stands out for his legitimately incredible ability to make so many sound effects of his voice, although he does come into his own more in the sequels.
My name is the man with a better plan.
The biggest compliment you can give George Gaines' terrific performance as Commandant Lassard is that it's not a shame that the role wasn't played by Leslie Nielsen, who it originally had been written for. G.W. Bailey is so perfectly cast as then Lieutenant, later Captain Harris. And Steve Guttenberg is great as Mahoney, in a role which could come across as obnoxious very easily, but in fact became the part which began his meteoric rise. Pretty much all the cast get their time to shine though, and it's difficult to imagine anyone else playing the roles. Some of the comedy in this first film, when you watch it through a modern lens, might cause shock to some viewers now, but the world was a very different place in 1984. Offensive language, racial slurs, questionable misogyny, or even outright sexism regularly feature in a lot of famous movies from the era. I'm not condoning it, that's just the reality. With that said, issues such as racism are actually dealt with in a more nuanced and mature way than you might expect in the first Police Academy film. And slurs used in the film generally highlight how uninformed the characters who use them are. In the end though, Police Academy knows where its priorities lie. Though it tackles some hot-button issues, it's a film built for escapism, hinging on ridiculous comedic moments combined with a strong ensemble cast. This isn't Citizen Kane and it's not trying to be. Variety is, or at least variety was, a vital part of the unique joy of going to the cinema, for whatever crimes against cinema might have been committed by the franchise in later years. And we'll certainly get to that, and the circumstances around it. The Police Academy cinematic universe began on a pretty positive note overall. I think it would be fair at this point to confess that I'm a Police Academy apologist.
It's true.
The theme song is also unquestionably a banger. It was delivered by composer Robert Falk, who went on to have an extensive career across film and TV, including work on the likes of Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls, The Never-Ending Story 2, and of course, Beastmaster 2, Through the Portal of Time. It's so good, in fact, that I'm surprised the country hasn't attempted to adopt it as their national anthem. It would go down a storm in an Olympics medal ceremony. Taking things on a bit of a tangent for a second, let's talk about Steve Guttenberg in a bit more detail. Say what you will about whatever you will, but for me, Steve Guttenberg just is the 1980s. You'll have probably guessed already that this is an era of culture I've got a huge amount of affinity for, and I think it's pretty undervalued just how big a star he was.
Who makes Steve Guttenberg a star?
Even if his star shone most brightly for just a few years. I mean, the man had a back-to-back hit list in the 80s which started with Police Academy and then included 3 Men and a Baby, Cocoon, and Short Circuit. It pretty much ended at the elite level after 3 Men and a Little Lady in 1990, but just an incredible run of films, and I mean that completely unironically. A great and underrated resume. He also just seems like a really cool guy. Sure, he did turn down the role of Peter Venkman in Ghostbusters, as well as the lead in Big, which eventually went to Tom Hanks, but we can't have everything in life, can we? I've quoted fairly liberally from his autobiography, The Guttenberg Bible. Yes, The Guttenberg Bible, in this video, and I'd highly recommend picking a copy up. It captures an incredible time in pop culture on the front line. Anyway, there's something endearingly simple about the universe which Police Academy presents to us. It's clearly our world, or at least a 1980s North American version of our world, but it strips away a lot of the complications we see in our real, more difficult lives. I think this is where much of the criticism about one-dimensional characters comes from, but this is a farcical version of reality, even if the film doesn't avoid confronting some clear and present issues within society. There is a bit of a sitcom vibe, and as with sitcoms you'd expect some further characterization to be handled later in the series, but yeah, we'll get to that. Across its cinema run, Police Academy spent 13 weeks in the US box office top 10, and it would have stayed there even longer were 1984 not one of the most hit-loaded years in film history, as well as being, of course, the year the Hot Dog Partnership released Hot Dog, the movie.
It's Hot Dog, the movie.
As a film, Police Academy was deliberately ridiculous, but taking its place proudly within the highest grossing films of such a strong year meant that it had to be respected. Take a look at the top performing films of 1984. What instantly strikes you about the list? It might be the sheer variety of output on it, or that comedy and original concepts take the majority of the spots, or it could simply be that this was a banner year for Hollywood. Even if you think Police Academy is rubbish, 1984 still saw numerous classics arriving in cinemas for the very first time, with iconic films such as The Terminator not even able to make the top 10 list. Other film offerings from the year included John Hughes' debut film 16 Candles, along with future cult classics like The Last Starfighter and The Never-Ending Story, with critically lauded dramatic fare such as The Killing Fields, A Passage to India, and Amadeus also debuting in cinemas, the latter of which making more than $90 million and sweeping the board at the 1985 Oscars. The big winner at the 1984 Oscars the year before, Terms of Endearment, grossed over $165 million after its release in December 1983, the same month that saw Brian De Palma's Scarface arrive on the silver screen. A release slate like this seems unthinkable in the present day. Given that Hollywood has continued to increasingly put all its eggs into the baskets of endless superhero movies and rebooting established IP over the last decade or more. It's also pretty sobering to compare 1984's output with the top-grossing films of recent years, the vast majority of which are retreads and pre-existing stories. They're not all bad films, and the technical craft is often mind-blowing, but even these retreads appear to be increasingly losing their financial impact. And in recent times, Hollywood has produced little else. The lack of original ideas is painful at times. The whole Barbenheimer phenomenon has ably demonstrated that, at a time when cinema attendance is generally way down and the industry itself is struggling to navigate the new digital age, that people really do still love going to the movies when they think it's worth it. The splintering of our media consumption certainly hasn't helped matters, and there are numerous other contributing factors which have left mainstream cinema in its current state. That's a whole other video in itself though. Putting the endless sequels aside for a second, Police Academy was a low-budget, breakout smash hit which, in turn, delivered serious amounts of profit, as have been numerous other examples across the decades. Given that there are so many promotional tools to go viral in the present day, surely these more lo-fi movies are a lower risk than the tanker-sized amounts lathered on endless reimaginings. Especially if a few of the lower budget films do manage to connect with a wide audience. I'm keenly aware that this whole section has more than a hint of an old man yelling at clouds vibe, and I'm not anticipating the modern Police Academy equivalent to suddenly arrive and gross hundreds of millions of dollars, but it does feel like Hollywood is missing a trick. The silly farcical comedies, romantic comedies, or really comedies of any kind, the adult-oriented dramas, as well as other genres just aren't really anywhere to be seen on the cinema release slate, sacrificed at the altar of massive budget blockbuster behemoths. Some occasionally sneak through of course, but the system is no longer built to deliver them. On the very rare occasion a comedy makes it to a wide cinema release, it seems like the fate of the genre's entire cinematic future rests on a single film's financial takings. And that's a real shame. Anyway. Clearly, the unanticipated success of Police Academy demanded a sequel. And oh boy, was there a sequel. Or 6. Before the cinematic overindulgence could really begin in the second half of the 1980s, however, by the summer of '84, Warners were already keen for their once unwanted stepchild of a comedy hit to ride again. And they wanted it pretty sharp. In truth, the band never really even got the time to split up. After what had been an insanely successful opening weekend in March 1984, Warner Brothers were keen for Paul Maslansky to start work on a sequel as soon as possible. Having been forced to take on another project as soon as the first film had wrapped just to pay his bills, after the success of Police Academy, Maslansky was once again afforded little opportunity to relax, only this time thanks to the bonanza takings demanding an immediate sequel. Principal photography first began for Police Academy 2 in Toronto on the 18th of August 1984, less than 5 months after the release date of the first film. Even for Hollywood, that is an insanely fast turnaround, especially for a follow-up to a film most execs thought would tank, and which had neither a script nor sequel options written into the contracts. Right here were the first indications that the Police Academy factory was starting to become activated. Dollar signs were in the eyes of the power brokers for sure.
We've got to have money.
Pulling together the cast and crew to return to the Police Academy fold proved to be more difficult than Paul Maslansky had originally envisioned. Director Hugh Wilson chose to bow out of the franchise, deciding instead to cash in his chips after the success of the first film to make his passion project, a singing cowboy comedy called Rustler's Rhapsody.
In Rustler's Rhapsody, from the director of Police Academy,
which Wilson envisaged as the new Blazing Saddles. He took G.W. Bailey, aka Harris, along with him for the ride. Rustler's Rhapsody would later become both a box office bomb and a critical disaster.
He's coming! And he's standing in the saddle!
Standing in the saddle?
So Maslansky needed a new director for sure, but he might have also needed a new leading man as well. Steve Guttenberg was initially unimpressed by the script for Police Academy 2. He simply didn't feel that it was as funny as the first film. By this point, he was being cast in big-time pictures such as Splash director Ron Howard's follow-up film, Cocoon, and he had a sense of leverage which hadn't been afforded to him before. After discussions with Maslansky and tweaks to the script, however, Guttenberg signed on for Police Academy 2, their first assignment. The increased pay packet, some of the rest of the key players from the first film were happy to receive as well, sweetened the deal. Most of the remaining cast signed up to return, aside from Leslie Easterbrook as she was pregnant. This would be the only film in the series in which her character Callahan did not feature. Kim Cattrall also abandoned ship after the first one as she, in her own words, wanted to become more of a leading lady instead of the girl. She would later have another hit a couple of years later with Mannequin, although, just like Police Academy, the film couldn't avoid a critical savaging. There was still also the issue around the empty director's chair. Maslansky was provided one by the studio in the form of James Signorelli, a Saturday Night Live crew member who had directed the 1983 Rodney Dangerfield vehicle Easy Money. Sadly, this cinematic marriage was a short-lived one, with Maslansky quickly realising things wouldn't work out with Signorelli. He hadn't even seen the first one. I said to myself, oh. Signorelli was quickly given the heave-ho and replaced by Jerry Paris, an actor who had transitioned to directing sitcoms, having helmed episodes of The Odd Couple, Laverne and Shirley, and something called Blanksy's Beauties.
I'm Arkansas Bates from Little Rock, Arkansas, and we're all Blansky's beauties. Fame and the fortune, waiting to be won, I want it all.
He'd also been in the chair for 237, yes, 237 episodes of Happy Days. So to say he was experienced in directing sitcoms would be an understatement. At the request of Maslansky, almost 3 weeks of footage shot by Signorelli was shelved, and by mid-October 1984, production under new director Paris had moved from Toronto to Los Angeles. The screenplay came from Saturday Night Live staffers Barry Blaustein and David Sheffield, who later went on to write Coming to America and The Nutty Professor, with Blaustein also writing and directing the outstanding 1999 pro wrestling documentary Beyond the Mat. Seriously, go out of your way to see this film. Even if you think wrestling is ridiculous and fake and nonsense, it's all-time great stuff. Police Academy 2, their first assignment, centred around the now graduated police officers working with grizzled partner cops as they looked to deal with a gang called the Scallions, who were causing chaos in the 16th precinct. The gang are led by Zed, played by franchise debutant Bobcat Goldthwait, who had been discovered working the comedy clubs of LA, and gives a bit of a tour de force performance across the film. Other new arrivals for the sequel included Lance Kinsey as Sergeant Proctor, Howard Hesseman as Commandant Lasard's brother Pete, and Art Matrano as Lieutenant Mauser. As Steve Guttenberg remembers, the benefits of success were clear to see from how much Paul Maslansky's situation had changed over the last 12 months. He was a working producer before these films, and now he was a net point success story. He had new Range Rovers, he had a personal trainer, and he went to all the best places. Once again, the critics brutalised Police Academy 2, labelling it moronic, trash, and even a pale imitation of the first, which itself had received a critical hammering.
One of the surprise hits of 1983 was Police Academy. Why did people go to see that picture? I don't know. Well, I'll say this much for Police Academy 2. It has 2 more laughs in it than the first picture, which means it has a total of 2 laughs in it. Those are 2 funny bits that last a total of perhaps 10 seconds. Unfortunately, Police Academy 2 lasts about 90 minutes longer than that.
Police Academy 2 was released on March 29, 1985, almost exactly 12 months on from the first film, and, once again, the critical mass's derision just didn't matter. Eclipsing the opening weekend takings of the first film, the sequel took residence at the top of the US box office for a month, even if in the end the American cinema run was a drop-off from the word-of-mouth smash original. This was still a hugely profitable endeavour, especially when taking into account the international performance, which for Police Academy 2 overtook the US domestic income, a trend which would inform creative decisions going forward for the franchise and even foreshadowed the importance of the foreign market to modern-day Hollywood. Worldwide theatrical takings of almost $115 million would be the equivalent of $328 million in today's money, meaning that the first 2 Police Academy films, adjusted for inflation, grossed $768 million from cinema takings alone.
Now that's a spicy meatball.
Sure, the chart of top-performing films of 1985 wasn't quite as packed with classics as 1984's equivalent season had been, with the spring list clogged up with the likes of Mask, the Care Bears movie, and yes, Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. Still, a hit is a hit, and that's most certainly what their first assignment had become. As Steve Guttenberg recalls, the good times were well and truly rolling after the release of the sequel. It felt as if I were covered in tinsel. Paul Maslansky had an enormous pile of points, and he shared them with all of us. Warner Brothers couldn't do enough for the cast. I was told I was in the Warner Brothers family. And the family wanted to do another Police Academy. The factory was already being prepped to churn out more for sure. With the audience for Police Academy well established now, the additional income from post-cinema deals was pretty much a sure thing from the get-go. Home video and worldwide TV distribution delivered millions more to the coffers. HBO and other broadcasters couldn't wait to get a hold of their first assignment.
Premieres Tuesday, April 1st on HBO.
I've been chucking a lot of numbers at you here, but the point is that 2 films in, Police Academy was making a lot of people a lot of cash. In an industry which constantly battles between art and commerce, it's very easy to see why the sequel conveyor belt really kicked into action for the rest of the decade. It's interesting to watch Police Academy 2, their first assignment, back now. It feels more mundane than the first film for sure, and has an even higher level of sitcom factor. The second installment in the franchise does manage to surf the line between comedy and annoyance though. It takes a while to get going, introducing a huge number of new characters with previous ones dropped without much mention. But this is still a fun enough way to spend 90 minutes. There is little to no character development across the board too, but the film is at least pretty funny in places. Which I guess, in the end, is kind of the point.
The point! I know the point!
Sadly, for the Lad Company, despite the Police Academy bonanza, their time was already up. A string of flops released in the early 80s essentially put an end to the company as a going concern, before Police Academy 2 had even made it into production. Despite the success of their new hit franchise, Warner's stopped working with Lad, and Police Academy 2 will be one of the last films the company would release before shutting down operations. With Warner's now in sole command of the Police Academy universe, the franchise was in somewhat of a strange place. Reviled by experts, but stonkingly profitable, not once but twice, by the summer of 1985 a third film was already in the works with no end in sight for the assembly line. The money being generated was immense, or at least the profit margins were huge, and overseas audiences had embraced Police Academy to a big degree. Hollywood was striking while the iron was hot, or was it actually going to end up running the franchise into the ground? Even though everything seemed perfect from a distance, the warning signs of burnout and overindulgence were there to see if you looked hard enough. Either way, by September 1985, production for Police Academy 3 would be getting underway, for better or for worse. Next time, the sequels just keep on coming. Plus there's expansion to numerous new media platforms, non-hit singles, the dawn of the age of the Police Academy ripoff, and the franchise enduring some of the most ridiculous moments of comedy ever committed to film. As the 1980s flows towards the 1990s, is the Police Academy franchise engaged in an overkill-induced race to the bottom? Or was this all, in hindsight, a stroke of mad genius? Is the critical derision spot on? Or do the later films in the series have at least some redeeming qualities? And how do you, or can you ever hope to, solve a problem like replacing the Goot? All that and much more in part 2 of No Laughing Matter, the deepest Police Academy franchise dive you are ever likely to see, courtesy of your friendly neighbourhood culture slice.